That night, everyone else was asleep, but Boromir's mind was not quiet. As he stared into the small golden ring, he began to wonder if the power to save Gondor had been in front of him all along. The campfire was slowly dying. The large flames that had once lit the night had faded into quiet embers. Wind moved softly through the trees, stirring the leaves in the darkness. The fellowship slept. Silence rested gently over the camp, but Boromir remained awake. He sat beside a tree, elbows resting on his knees. Even the heavy armor on his shoulders seemed tired now. His eyes drifted far beyond the firelight. He was thinking about Gondor, the White City, its towering walls, and the people waiting behind them in fear. The shadow in the east was growing. Boromir could feel it. As war approached, he could not stop thinking about how alone Gondor had become. Rohan was distant. The elves had withdrawn into their own lands, and the hopes of men were fading with every passing season. Then his father's voice echoed inside his mind. Gondor needs strong men. Boromir closed his eyes. He had heard those words his entire life. Be strong, stand firm. Do not fear. But tonight, for the first time, he wondered if strength alone would ever be enough. When he opened his eyes again, a small golden glimmer caught his attention, the ring resting silently beside the fire. It looked small, almost insignificant, and yet Boromir could not look away from it. There was a weight inside that thing, as if it were made of more than gold, as if something else lived within it. Boromir exhaled slowly. Perhaps Elrond was wrong. Perhaps such power was not meant to be destroyed. Perhaps men needed it. The moment the thought appeared in his mind, Boromir immediately turned away, almost ashamed of himself, but it was already too late. Because once the thought had taken shape, it did not leave easily. Boromir looked back at the ring, and the fire burned lower. As the night deepened, the forest grew quieter. The fire had almost disappeared now, leaving behind only a few glowing embers that pulsed softly in the darkness. Shadows gathered heavily around the camp, and the trees stood like enormous stone pillars beneath the night sky. Boromir still could not sleep. Even when he looked away from the ring, he could not escape the thoughts it had left behind. Gondor returned to his mind once more. The white walls of Minas, its narrow stone streets, the soldiers standing watch even through the night, and the people trying to hide their fear from their children. Boromir remembered their faces. As war drew closer, even the silence inside the city had changed. People no longer spoke loudly. Hope itself had become a whisper, because everyone felt the same thing. The darkness was coming. Boromir inhaled slowly. He had spent his entire life fighting for Gondor. He believed it was his duty, but now, for the first time, he wondered if swords alone would ever be enough. The strength of Mordor was growing. The strength of men was fading, and right before him rested the greatest power in the world. Boromir looked toward the ring again. There was something deeply unsettling about it, and yet the feeling was not entirely evil. It felt like hope. Dangerous hope. Slowly, Boromir reached out his hand. As his fingers moved closer, he imagined he could feel warmth radiating from the small golden band. The ring glimmered quietly beside the dying fire, and for a moment, Boromir imagined himself standing upon the walls of Minas Tirith. But this time the city was not afraid. The orcs were retreating. The armies of Mordor were falling apart. The people of Gondor were shouting with hope once again, and the White City still stood strong. Boromir closed his eyes immediately. These thoughts were wrong. He knew that. The ring was dangerous. Elrond had said so. Gandalf too. Even Aragorn seemed uneasy whenever he looked at it. And still, Boromir could not silence the question growing quietly inside him. If such power truly existed, why should it not be used? Why should men only hide in fear? Why should Gondor be left to fall? The wind moved once more through the trees. Boromir pulled his hand away, but his mind no longer felt as calm as before, because the ring no longer seemed like a simple object. It seemed like a possibility, and sometimes hope and danger looked very much alike. The silence within the forest no longer felt the same. It was as though the night carried not only darkness, but thoughts as well. Boromir sat motionless beside the dying fire while his eyes drifted once more toward the ring. The small golden band remained exactly where it had been before, silent, still, and yet Boromir could feel its presence, as though the ring was touching his thoughts without ever speaking aloud. He frowned slightly and turned his head away. The idea sounded foolish. A ring could not speak, and yet the thoughts inside his mind no longer felt entirely like his own. Some of them arrived too easily. Gondor can still be saved. Boromir closed his eyes. That was his own thought. It had to be. But the thought returned. If the power lies before you, why refuse it? Boromir inhaled deeply. Wind moved softly through the trees, while the distant sound of flowing water echoed faintly through the night. The camp remained quiet. Everyone else slept. And for the first time in many years, Boromir felt truly alone, because the battle was no longer only against Mordor. It was against his own mind. He looked toward the ring again. It seemed small, but the weight inside his thoughts was growing heavier. Slowly, Boromir began asking questions he had tried to avoid. What if Elrond was wrong? What if the wise feared this power simply because they lacked the courage to use it? What if men were meant to fight instead of hide? These thoughts were dangerous. Boromir knew that, but the most frightening thing of all was how reasonable they were beginning to sound. For a brief moment, he imagined Gondor once more, but this time the city was not burning. Its gates were not falling. Mordor was retreating, and the people shouted Boromir's name through the streets. Savior, Protector, Son of Gondor. Boromir suddenly opened his eyes. His heartbeat had grown faster. He turned away from the ring, but the thoughts did not leave, because the ring still rested there in silence, without speaking a single word. It was slowly settling inside his mind. As the night deepened, the camp fell into complete silence. Even the wind moved more slowly now, as though the forest itself had drifted into sleep. Boromir slowly turned his head. A short distance away, Frodo slept quietly beside the fading fire. The small hobbit lay wrapped in his blanket near the last remaining warmth of the embers. His face looked peaceful, too peaceful. Boromir watched him silently for a long moment. The fate of the world rested upon the shoulders of this small creature, and Boromir struggled to understand it. Frodo was brave. He could not deny that. Throughout their journey, Boromir had witnessed the hobbit's endurance many times, and still, the burden seemed far too great for him. Boromir's eyes slowly drifted toward the chain around Frodo's neck. The ring glimmered faintly in the darkness, and for a moment a strange feeling rose inside him, as though the ring belonged to the wrong person. The thought disturbed him, because it did not feel entirely like greed. It felt more like responsibility. Boromir thought of Gondor again, its walls, his father, Denethor, the soldiers dying upon distant battlefields. And then he looked back at Frodo. The hobbit slept peacefully, but Boromir could no longer understand that peace. How could someone carrying the weight of the world sleep so calmly? Slowly, Boromir stood up. The final warmth of the fire flickered faintly across the edges of his armor. He took a few quiet steps forward, then stopped. Still watching Frodo, the thought inside him was growing stronger now. Perhaps the ring should never have been given to him. Boromir lowered his head immediately. The thought was dangerous, and yet it had already begun settling into his mind. Because the ring did not only promise power, it also offered justification, and Boromir was beginning to feel it. For the first time, he wondered if he should be the one carrying the burden instead. When Boromir returned to the fire, the night had grown heavier. The sky could no longer be seen. Black shadows from the trees covered the forest entirely, separating the small camp from the rest of the world. Boromir sat down quietly, but his mind was far from quiet. His father had returned to his thoughts once again. Denethor, steward of Gondor, his cold eyes, his stern voice, and the endless burden he carried upon his shoulders. Ever since childhood, Boromir had seen the same thing within his father's gaze. Expectation. He was expected to be strong. He was expected to succeed, because Gondor did not forgive weakness. Boromir stared into the fire. The small red embers flickered softly, breathing within the darkness. For a moment, he remembered the great halls of Minas Tirith, the long stone corridors, the silent guards, and the nights when his father sat alone upon the high stone seat. Denethor never showed fear openly, but Boromir knew him well. His father was afraid. Afraid of Mordor, afraid of the coming war, afraid of the day Gondor might finally fall. Perhaps that was why so much weight had been placed upon Boromir's shoulders, because a son was not merely family. A son was meant to become a shield. Boromir slowly lowered his head. He had spent his entire life fighting for Gondor. He had bled for it, lost brothers beside it, and given his years to war. And now, the power to save the world rested only a few steps away from him. Yet he was forbidden to use it. The thought unsettled him deeply. Why? Why should such power only be destroyed? Boromir clenched his fists slightly. If Gondor fell, if the White City burned, if its people died, then who would carry the blame? Elrond, Gandalf, or those who chose to do nothing at all? Boromir inhaled deeply. He could feel the ring changing him, but he felt something else as well. Determination. For the first time, his desire for the ring no longer felt like simple temptation. It felt like duty, and that thought frightened him even more. As the night slowly passed, the cold within the forest deepened. The fire had nearly disappeared now, leaving behind only small red embers that glowed from time to time. The camp remained silent. Somewhere far away, the sound of flowing water blended softly with the wind moving through the trees. Boromir sat motionless, but his mind would not rest. The ring no longer appeared to him as merely a powerful object. It seemed like a solution. Slowly, Boromir lifted his head and looked into the dark forest around him. All his life, he had been taught what it meant to be a hero, to protect others, to fight despite fear, to sacrifice oneself when necessary. That was how the sons of Gondor were raised. And now, if the ring truly possessed the power to stand against Mordor, was it truly wrong to use it? Boromir found himself asking the same question again and again, because the thoughts inside his mind were changing. Wanting the ring no longer felt selfish. Instead, refusing it was beginning to feel wrong. Boromir closed his eyes. For a moment, he remembered the battlefields he had walked across, broken walls, soldiers fallen into the mud, the smell of blood, and the moments when men retreated in fear. Then another vision came. This time, Gondor was victorious. The orcs were retreating. People shouted with hope once more, and at the center of that victory stood Boromir. But the thought did not bring him peace. Instead, it filled him with quiet unease, because he was beginning to realize he could no longer fully trust his own mind. He could feel the ring changing his thoughts, and yet at the same time, he could not say those thoughts were entirely wrong. That was the most dangerous part. If evil appeared openly evil, it would be easier to fight against it. But the ring was different. It did not show people their fears. It showed them their hopes. Boromir exhaled slowly. Perhaps that was why he could no longer stop looking at it, because the ring was not only promising power, it was promising that Gondor could still be saved, and Boromir wanted to believe it. The night now felt almost completely still. The wind had faded. The branches above no longer moved. The silence surrounding the camp had become so deep that even Boromir's breathing sounded too loud in his own ears. The fire was gone. Only darkness remained now, along with the faint scent of smoke drifting through the cold forest air. Slowly, Boromir straightened himself. For a while, he tried not to think at all. Not about the ring. Not about Gondor. Not about the quiet questions growing inside his mind. But the thoughts always returned, and each time they came back stronger than before. Boromir closed his eyes. "It is only a ring," he whispered softly to himself. But even those words no longer felt entirely true, because another voice inside him answered immediately, "No, it is far more than that." Boromir lowered his head into his hands. His heart felt heavy. All his life, he had faced enemies he could clearly see. He understood danger when it came with swords and armies. On the battlefield, he always knew what he was fighting against. But this was different. This time the enemy walked inside his own thoughts. Slowly, Boromir lifted his head, and without realizing it, he looked toward the ring once again. The small golden band glimmered quietly in the darkness. Boromir reached toward it without thinking. His fingers moved slowly closer. For a brief moment, everything became silent. The forest, the wind, even his thoughts. It felt as though the world itself had stopped breathing. His hand was only inches away now, and then fear suddenly rose inside him, sharp, immediate. Boromir pulled his hand back quickly. He inhaled sharply, almost as though he had touched fire. For several seconds he remained frozen in place. Then slowly he stood and stepped backward into the darkness. His heart was beating faster now, because for the first time he truly understood something. He was no longer merely thinking about the ring. He wanted it. Boromir stared out into the dark forest. Quiet shame slowly settled inside him. But beneath that shame, another feeling remained. He still believed the ring could save Gondor, and that thought disturbed him more than his fear itself. The darkness within the forest was slowly beginning to thin. Morning had not yet arrived, but the deepest part of the night had passed. The blackness between the trees no longer felt completely empty. Somewhere in the distance, faint traces of grey light were beginning to emerge. Boromir had not slept. Throughout the night, the thoughts inside his mind had grown larger, tangled together, and finally settled around a single thing. The ring. Avoiding it was becoming more difficult with every passing hour. Boromir quietly began walking along the edge of the camp. Leaves cracked softly beneath his boots, while cold air slipped through the gaps in his armor. After a while, he stopped. Frodo was still asleep. The small hobbit rested quietly beneath his blanket, breathing softly. Around his neck, the chain holding the ring glimmered faintly beneath the pale moonlight. Boromir watched him for a long moment. Then slowly, a thought began taking shape inside his mind. Perhaps he should speak to Frodo, calmly, reasonably. He could explain Gondor to him, the coming war, the fear spreading across the lands of men, and the power the ring might offer against the darkness. Boromir began convincing himself that this was the right thing to do. If Frodo was truly good, then surely he could understand why Gondor needed help. Boromir exhaled slowly. The thought brought him comfort, because now he no longer saw himself as someone trying to take the ring by force. No, he was simply trying to do what was right. At least that was what he told himself. But deep within his mind, something else remained. Quiet, dark, and impatient. Boromir could feel it, because the small golden ring hanging around Frodo's neck no longer looked merely like a weapon. It looked like something that belonged to him. Boromir immediately turned his eyes away. His heart felt heavier now. The thoughts inside him were beginning to merge together. Duty, hope, fear, and desire, all becoming the same thing. Somewhere in the distance, the first bird call echoed softly through the trees. The night was ending, and Boromir could already feel that the coming dawn would bring more than another day. It would bring a choice. The first pale light of morning slowly spread across the forest. Mist still drifted between the trees, as though the night itself refused to fully disappear. The camp was beginning to wake. Somewhere in the distance came the faint sounds of movement, while cold air rose softly from the damp ground. But the silence inside Boromir's mind had vanished completely. The thoughts that had grown throughout the night were no longer merely thoughts. They were becoming decisions. Boromir slowly walked deeper into the forest. After a short while, he heard quiet footsteps behind him. Frodo, the small hobbit, approached silently, his grey cloak almost blending into the pale morning mist. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Boromir lifted his head. "Frodo," he said softly. His voice tried to sound calm, but there was a heavy strain beneath it. For a while, Boromir carefully chose his words. He spoke about Gondor, the coming war, the loneliness of the White City, the fear spreading among its people. Then slowly, his eyes drifted toward the ring. This power, he whispered quietly, perhaps it was not meant to be destroyed. Frodo's expression changed immediately. Boromir noticed, but by now it was becoming difficult to stop, because the more he spoke, the more real the thoughts became. "Think about it," Boromir said. "If the armies of Gondor possessed such power," his voice was growing faster now, "men would no longer need to fear Mordor." Frodo stepped backward. Boromir saw it, and in that moment, something inside him cracked. Because Frodo's fear angered him. Suddenly, Boromir felt completely alone, as though no one truly understood the darkness that was coming, as though he alone could see the truth. "You do not understand," he said, his voice harder now. "This is not only your burden." Frodo took another step back. Boromir's heartbeat quickened. Now he was staring only at the ring. Only the ring. The small golden band glimmered silently beneath the pale light of dawn, and for the first time Boromir realized something. He did not merely want the ring anymore. He believed he needed it. And the moment that thought fully settled inside his mind, even the sound of his own voice began to feel unfamiliar. But by then, turning back no longer seemed easy. The silence within the forest suddenly felt different. The thoughts that had consumed Boromir only moments earlier now seemed scattered and distant, as though a heavy fog had suddenly lifted, leaving behind nothing but shame. Frodo was stepping backward. Fear filled the small hobbit's eyes, and Boromir, for the first time that night, began seeing himself clearly. His breathing grew heavier. He stepped back once, then again. For several moments, he could not speak at all. He thought about the words he had spoken, the anger in his voice, the desire he had felt while staring at the ring, and worst of all, how desperately he had tried to justify it all. Boromir lowered his head. "What am I doing?" he whispered quietly. Frodo continued, watching him carefully, ready to flee at any moment. And when Boromir realized this, the weight inside him grew even heavier, because in that moment, he finally understood something. The ring did not simply offer power. It ruled people through their fears, and Boromir's fear was losing Gondor. For a while, only the sound of the wind moved through the trees. Morning light spread more clearly now across the forest. The night was fading, and the long shadows between the trees slowly began disappearing. Boromir looked toward Frodo with tired eyes, then quietly stepped away. "Go," he said softly. There was no anger left in his voice now, only shame, and the exhaustion of a broken man. Boromir sat beside a tree and looked down at his hands. These hands had fought for Gondor for many years, but tonight they had nearly failed against his own mind. He inhaled deeply, then closed his eyes. For a long time, he said nothing. But the silence inside him no longer felt the same, because for the first time, Boromir was beginning to understand what the ring truly was. It did not merely corrupt people by force. It used their fears, their hopes, and even their love. Slowly, Boromir lifted his head. Far away, he could see Frodo's silhouette disappearing into the forest, and in that moment, only one thought remained within him. He had to protect him, no matter the cost, because Boromir finally understood something. True strength was not taking the ring, but choosing what was right despite it. The wind moved softly through the trees once more, and the first light of morning touched the face of the Son of Gondor.